Hello everyone, it's great to be back with you and talking about Waka poetry. In this video, we're going to have a formal Waka recital, or hikokai, something which it's a real privilege to be able to put on and hear, as they're not conducted very often, even in Japan nowadays. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Yasuhiro Mitarai from Miyagi University of Education, who is a colleague of mine in Waka studies. He is also, I'm happy to say, a trained and experienced poetry reciter in the style of the Reise family. More on them later. And he will be providing the recitations of the poems which we're going to share with you today. In planning for this event, we decided to mimic the structure of an imperial Japanese poetry anthology by beginning with poems on the seasons, then sharing some love poems, and finally some on miscellaneous topics. Most of the poems we will be sharing today are premodern Waka, but the last is composed by Dr. Mitarai himself, as, in addition to being a scholar of Japanese poetry, he is also an active Waka poet, and regularly participates in the annual Kyokusui no En event held at the Jonangu Shrine in the south of Kyoto in April. To begin with, though, we thought it would be useful to provide a brief introduction to formal Waka recital, starting with the roles which people take up at a formal poetry meet. In pre-modern times, there were a large number of different roles which people performed at a poetry meet, including sponsor, heads of the various teams, selectors of the poetic topics, people keeping the score, and even supporters, whose role it was to respond with appropriate applause when they heard a poem. Nowadays, however, as poetry meets tend to be smaller in scale, these multiple roles have been condensed down to 4, held mainly by the people responsible for actually performing the poems. These roles are as follows. First, the reader or dokuji. In modern times, this is the individual who is responsible for managing the meet and indicating when poems should be read. In pre-modern times, however, the role of reader was assigned to an individual of recognised poetic knowledge and authority who would receive the poems as they were written, check them for errors, and only then pass them on to the people who would actually perform them out loud. As such, it was a role which was usually held by an older poet and/or senior noble. The second role is reciter, or koji. The main qualifications for this role was, and is, to be able to read the poem aloud, line by line, in a loud and clear voice. The audience, of course, would not be able to read or see the text of the poems, and so it was important before the formal recital of them that they were able to hear each word clearly and so get a sense of the poem's meaning. In fact, one of the key critical criteria for judging the quality of a poem was whether it could be easily understood when heard without having to be read. After the reciter's reading of a poem, it would next be chanted according to a set rhythm and melody by a descanter, hassei. Obviously, one of the key qualifications for serving as descanter was that one should have a good singing voice. Once the descanter had finished, a number of other individuals, the number could range anywhere from between 2 and 4, would chant the poem together. They are known as the chorus or kosho. The image which you can see here shows how the individuals performing these various roles are seated at a formal poetry meet in the Reise style. In pre-modern times, it would be men occupying all of these roles, not because women did not compose poetry or did not take part in poetry meets, but because social convention was that women should speak quietly, if at all, in public. This meant that convention more or less ruled them out from participating in these events, because everyone needed to speak loudly. This is not to say that it never happened at all. The preface to the Teiji-in poetry match, held by Emperor Uda in 913, results that he had 4 of his female chamberlains recite the poems for the event. Only 8 years later, however, the preface to the poetry match held by the Kyogoku Lady of the Bedchamber relates that the intention had been to have court ladies recite the poems, but because they were unable to do it very well, the 2 male nobles took over the task at short notice. The most likely explanation for this is not that the women were unable to recite the poems, but that they were unwilling to recite them loudly enough in public. We have no other evidence at all of women participating in the recitation of poetry at public events, although, of course, there are numerous poetry matches which were private and where all the participants were women. So it seems likely that women would have recited the poems at these times. As an aside, just how unusual it was to hear a noblewoman performing in public is emphasised by Asukai Masaari in his diary Saga no Kaioi, where, in an entry dated to 1269, he recounts that he visited the residence of Fujiwara no Tame-ie to attend a lecture by him on Genji Monogatari. As part of the lecture, Tame-ie called upon his wife, Abutsu, to read passages from Genji aloud from behind her curtain. Masaari was so stunned by hearing a woman speak loudly enough to be heard through a curtain and throughout a room that he devotes his diary entry to describing this and does not refer to the content of Tame-ie's lecture, hearing which was the purpose of his visit, at all. Tabuchi Kumiko suggests that the reasons why Tame-ie felt able to ask Abutsu to perform in this way were, first, because of her age. At about 47, she would have been considered old, and second, because by this point she had already taken orders as a Buddhist nun, and it appears that the taboo against women speaking in public was relaxed for both the elderly and religious. In any case, in modern times, as you can see from this picture, women participate in poetry meets as both descanters and as members of the chorus, in the Reizei style at least. The Reizei are the descendants of Fujiwara no Teika, Japan's most influential and famous court poet, and devote themselves to protecting his cultural legacy, both in terms of the styles and practices of waka poetry, and also the manuscript collections which he and his sons bequeathed to posterity. Included in that legacy are the tunes to which waka are formally recited. For the Reizei there are three: Kocho, high tone, Otsu no Ko, low-high, and Otsu no Otsu, low-low, referring to whether there is a change of pitch in the recitation of a waka. The choice of which tune is used to recite which poem is made according to where the poem is positioned in a poetry meet. That is, it has nothing to do with the words, content or emotional tone of the poetry itself, simply where it comes in the meet, beginning, middle or end. So Dr. Mitarai will be using all three of these as we progress through our poems today. He will also be filling the roles of both reciter and descanter. What we are going to do is show you the Romanized transcription of each poem as Dr. Mitarai recites it, accompanied by an image which conveys some of the poem's sense. We will then show you my English translation of the poem while Dr. Mitarai chants it, and I'll then give a brief explanation of each poem's source, imagery and meanings. I think we've had enough preamble, so let's get on with the poems. Spring Poems, Haru no Uta.
朝緑延べの霞はつつめどもこぼれてにおふ花桜かな朝みどりのべのかすみはつつめどもこぼれてにほふ花桜かな
In some ways, this is an archetypal spring waka. It refers to one of the key colours, the pale green of new leaves, two of the key symbols, haze and cherry blossoms, and one of the locations where spring would be most keenly observed and experienced. In keeping with many of the poems of this period, there's an element of artful confusion. The haze, the poet observes, is both the meteorological phenomenon, but also the way the clouds of cherry blossom fill his or her sight. The word nyohu, which I've translated here as glow, could also mean fragrance, and so both senses are present here, the luminosity of the blossoms, but also their scent. This poem comes from the poetry contest held by the Empress Dowager during the reign of the Kampyo Emperor, referring to Princess Nakako, or Hanshi, the mother of Emperor Uda, which was held in 893 to celebrate her 60th birthday. It seems to have originally had 100 rounds and thus 200 poems, but only 193 have survived to modern times. There are no other records of such large-scale events taking place at this time, so it seems most likely that it took place purely on paper, and the manuscript was gifted to Nakako later.
春深みかはずのすだく声すなり雪手やみましいでの山吹き春深みかはずのすだく声すなり雪てやみましでの山吹き
This poem comes from 220 or so years later, and is the first of our selection to use an utamakura, or poetic place name, that of Ide. Ide lies about 20 kilometres south of Kyoto and was a popular spot for the aristocratic pleasure excursions, so many poets would have a very good idea of what it looked like. In Waka, its key associations were with frogs and yellow keria blooms, and thus by association spring. The poet, Lady Daishin, quite cleverly builds up to the revelation of the location at the end of her poem, with the initial references to spring and frogs priming those in the poetic know to expect something like this. By this point in poetic history, acceptable words, emotions, and images were becoming more fixed, and so this sort of poem is both a statement of the poet's knowledge of good composition and also a reassurance to her audience. The Eikkyo 100 poem sequences is a collection of 701 poems composed by 7 poets, each one composing 100 poems on 100 individual topics, which was created as a memorial following the death of Emperor Horikawa's empress, Tokushi. While this poem is, as I have just said, reassuringly conventional, many of the chosen topics for this collection were novel or occurred only in earlier poetry matches or private collections. This means that it's, to some extent, an experimental intervention into Waka poetics, aimed at expanding the range of acceptable subjects. The intervention was only partially successful, but that's a topic for another time. My initial translation of the AQ 100 poem sequences are available on my website, www.wakapoetry.net, but a complete revised version of these, accompanied by detailed annotation and commentary, is in the works, and I hope will be published before too long. Watch this space. Summer poems, Natsu no Uta.
さつきまつ花立ち花の顔影は 昔の人の袖の数をする。さつきまつはなたちばなの顔かげば昔のお人の袖の数する。
This anonymous poem from Kokinshu, the ancient and modern collection of poetry, Japan's first imperial waka anthology, is extremely famous and was used as inspiration by countless poets in later years. The fifth month here is the fifth month of the lunar calendar, which falls approximately around the middle or end of May and the middle or end of June in our terms. The official months of summer were the fourth, fifth, and sixth months, so awaiting the fifth month really means awaiting for summer to reach its height. Orange blossom is the flower most strongly associated with the summer season too. The poet recognises the evocative power of scent to bring back memory, with the reference to perfumed sleeves. The aristocrats of the time used incense made, of course, from a range of natural sources, including orange blossom, to scent their robes, for the purely practical reason that bathing was not a custom by this point in Japanese history, and so the incense would cover up a multitude of less pleasant odours. Also, given the darkness of the average dwelling at this time, in some contexts it was easier to identify someone by their scent than by their face. Indeed, the secondary protagonist of the tale of Genji is nicknamed Kaoru, fragrance, because he has a unique and pleasant personal scent which announces his presence. The image here is of an old man remembering the past, but there is nothing in the poem to suggest this. The poet could be a woman. In keeping with many seasonal poems from this time, however, the poet overlays the seasonal imagery with suggestions of love. Hito, which I've translated as folk, is non-specific for number, and in love poetry is frequently used to refer to a special someone, male or female, so the poet could be thinking fondly back to the perfumed sleeves of a woman whom he loved many years before. There's a nostalgic air about it, and a suggestion that times were better back then, which generations of later poets found evocative. Autumn poems, Aki no Uta.
秋くれば宮山里こそわびしけれ夜は蛍を灯火にして秋くればみやまざとこそわびしけれ夜は ともしびにして。
This is a poem from the poetry match held at Prince Korisada's house, which was a precursor to the match for Hanshi, which took place later the same year. It's believed to have had 80 or 100 rounds originally, although only 71 poems survive in current manuscripts. This was an influential match in that many of its poems were incorporated into kokinshu and became important elements of the waka canon. On the surface, this poem is a straightforward description of the dimness of autumn at a mountain retreat, but it contains a number of overlaid meanings. First of all, aki, autumn, was homophonous with aki, a feeling of fullness or surfeit, either physically or emotionally. So the first line is both when the season of autumn comes and when I have had enough of things. What does a noble in that state do? He or she goes off to a mountain retreat, usually at a temple, to purify him or herself. The temple, being far from the excitement and pleasures of the capital, makes them feel desolate. Despite their original intentions, they long to return. It's a Buddhist-influenced message about the difficulty of escaping from the attachments of the mundane world. Fireflies were a commonly used insect in waka poetry, but not without controversy. Generations of judges and critics argued about whether they could be used only in summer poems, only in autumn poems, or in both. I follow Fujiwara no Shunzei, Taker's father, who argued for both.
溶けてねぬ夢じもしもにむすぼほれまず知る者はかたしきの袖溶けてねぬ夢じもしもにむすぼほれまず知るものはかたしきの袖
We now come to a poem by Taker himself. Sadaie is the Japanese reading of his name. This is a poem he composed for the monumental poetry contest in 600 rounds, which took place 300 years after Koresada's match. Just like our earlier summer example, Taker overlays his description of a night made cold by frost, one of the key symbols of autumn, with elements from love poetry. First of all, it was a common belief that if you saw someone in your dreams, they were thinking of you fondly or were in love with you. Taker's dreams are filled with nothing but frost, so the implication is that the woman he loves does not love him back. This is reinforced by the reference to katashiki no sode at the end of the poem. This literally means a single spread sleeve, and to understand what it means, you need to know how people of this time slept. They didn't have or use special night clothes, nor did they use blankets as a general rule. Instead, they would take off their outer robe, spread it out, and sleep under it, and if two people were sleeping together, they would spread out their robes on top of each other to sleep under. A single spread sleeve means the speaker was sleeping alone, without the person they loved, hence my translation of lonely sleeves. Winter, Fuyu no Uta.
目覚めして 誰かきくらん。この頃のこの葉にかかる弱のしぐれをねざめして誰かきくらこの頃のこの葉にかかるよはのしぐれを
We can see a similar ambiguous note in this early winter poem. We know it's early winter because of the use of showers. Who could be listening, she wonders. But the implication is that she has a special someone in mind. Has he been woken too? Was he lying awake thinking of her? We don't know, and neither does she. Love poems. Koi no uta. I should say at the outset that love is not a happy emotion in waka. There are 5 formal stages to a love affair, each marked by different types of misery. In the first, you're miserable because you love someone and they don't know it. Your love is unrequited. In the second, you've let them know your feelings, but you're miserable because you haven't managed to meet them yet. You're frustrated. In the third, you've met them and consummated the relationship, but are miserable because you have to spend time apart. In the fourth, you're miserable because the other party's affections are shifting elsewhere and they are being cold to you. And then finally, you're miserable because the affair is over and you're looking back and thinking how good it was when you were together. As you can see, there's not much room for joy, but in the love poems we've chosen for today, we have included one happy one, just to show that not all waka poets were miserable all the time.
小日により身のうせしよばくゆれどもなほなつむしになおやたちなんこひによりみのうせしよばくゆれどもなほなつむしになおやたちなん
Former Emperor Yorze's match contains 20 poems, all on the topic of love and summer insects, fireflies, in other words. Fire was commonly associated with love in waka because the 2 words for the emotion, kohi, love, and omohi, yearning, both contained hi, which was homophonous with the word for fire. The poem here is an early example of the metaphor of the poet's emotions being so overwhelming that their body cannot take it, that they're literally going to burn up with love and die. And this is the link with the image of fireflies, which also had only brief lives.
黒髪の乱れも知らず打ち伏せばまずかきやりし人底意識黒髪の乱れも知らず打ち伏せばまずかきやりし人ぞこひしき
This next poem is by Izumi Shikibu, who is one of the most notable, or some might say infamous, characters of pre-modern Japan. Following the breakup of her first marriage, she returned to the capital and became the lover of an imperial prince, who died shortly afterwards. Undeterred, she then became his brother's lover, and he broke with convention by spending so much time with her, he neglected his principal wife and scandalised court society. Izumi Shikubu was also unquestionably the greatest poet of her generation, and left behind a diary and a personal poetry collection, with many of the poems finding their way into imperial anthologies. In this poem, she expresses her fondness and passion for a nameless lover, but why should his attention to her hair be so significant? Why? Because women of the time never cut their hair, and it was frequently longer than they were tall. Any man who wouldn't care about it being tangled and would smooth it out was definitely a keeper.
あふことは夢のうちにも嬉しくて寝覚めの後ぞわびしかりけるあふことは夢のうちにも嬉しくて寝覚めの後ぞわびしかりける
Our last love poem comes from the match held by two princes of former Emperor Yose, which must have taken place before the 28th of August 943, as this was when one of the two princes in question, Motoyoshi, died. The match contains 39 poems on the topics of love on waking and love after morning partings, neither of which are cheery topics. In this poem, the poet has at least been able to meet the woman he loves in his dreams and so knows that she loves him back, but finding himself alone after waking only magnifies his misery. We don't know whether this poem was composed as a literary exercise or was one that one of the princes composed and actually sent to a lady as evidence of his feelings. Motoyoshi in particular got the reputation of something of a Lothario. The tales of Yamato, which date from 951, less than 10 years after his death, relate that he used to go secretly to one of his mansions so he could spy on the women passing by on the road outside. Miscellaneous poems, Zo no Uta.
坂しみと物言ふよりは酒飲みてひ泣きするし勝りたるらしいさかしみとものひふよりは酒飲みてひなきするしまさりたるらしい
This is an 8th century poem composed by Otomo no Tabito when he was serving as the governor of Kyushu, Japan's westernmost large island and a long way from Kyoto. This is an example of Tabito deliberately introducing tropes from Sinitic poetry into waka. There are numerous Tang poems about the joys of wine and taking refuge in wine as an escape from one's official duties. Tabito composed 13 poems in praise of sake, and we included it here just to show that the early waka poets weren't afraid of more direct and less delicate topics and emotions.
風になびく藤の煙の空に消えて行方も知らぬ我が面引かな風になびく藤のけぶりの空に消えて行方も知らぬ我が面引かな
final premodern waka is by Saigyo, who is probably the premodern poet best known and loved by the Japanese today. Saigyo was an early poetic pilgrim, making numerous journeys to famous locations and recording his emotions in poetry. Here, he uses the image of Fuji's smoke disappearing into the skies to describe how his emotions and thoughts equally seem to vanish. One of the potential implications, of course, is that he is so overwhelmed by the mountain's grandeur that he literally cannot think.
朝がすみ同じき春や長目県よもに明けゆく天のかぐ山朝がすみ同じき春や長目県よもに明けゆく天のかぐ山
For our final poem, we return to spring, Haru no Uta, for a work by Dr. Mitarai. Here, we have the questioning of spring. Just because it comes around every year, is it always the same? The answer, of course, is both yes and no. Ama no Kaguyama, the Mount of Heavenly Fragrances, is located in Asuka and is a very long-standing utamakara, much used for the associations of its name with seasonal scents. Dr. Mitarai's use of it thus links his composition with all those which have come before it, situating it as a worthy member of the Waka tradition. That's it for this Utakai poetry meet. We hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, feel free to drop any questions into the comments and like and share.